All right, so let's dive into some pretty interesting stuff today. I mean, some of this stuff is a little unsettling, to be honest with you.
Yeah, for sure.
You've sent us a ton of articles and reports, all about President-elect Trump's comments about Greenland, Panama, and Canada.
Right.
And I've seen all kinds of opinions out there.
Yeah.
Some people are saying it's like a brilliant grand strategy, and other people are saying it's just chaos.
Yeah. Definitely a lot to unpack.
So that's our mission today in this deep dive.
Right.
We're going to try to figure out what Trump actually said.
Okay.
We're going to look at what could happen because of it,
Sure.
and hopefully give you enough info so you can make up your own mind about what it all means.
Sounds good.
So first, I think we should do a quick recap of what Trump actually said about each place.
Okay.
Let's start with Greenland. He said on Truth Social that ownership and control is an absolute necessity. So this isn't the first time he's talked about Greenland, right?
You're absolutely right. Back in 2019, he made a lot of waves when he said he wanted to buy Greenland.
Oh, yeah. And at the time, there were reports that Ronald Lauder, he's a longtime friend of Trump's, and heir to the Estee Lauder fortune.
Right.
He might have been the one who gave Trump that idea in the first place.
Huh. Interesting.
And now with this new statement where he's emphasizing how important Greenland is for national security and freedom, it seems like he's still interested.
Yeah, it really does seem that way. Especially
Yeah.
since we already have a pretty big presence there with Thule Air Base, which is our northernmost base.
Right.
Then there's Panama, where Trump's been pretty vocal.
Hmm.
He's been accusing Panama of ripping off the U.S. with the Panama Canal shipping rates.
Uh-huh.
He even suggested that China's involved, which the Panamanian president completely denied.
Yeah, those accusations are definitely raising eyebrows, especially the part about Chinese soldiers operating the canal.
Right.
The Panamanian president called that complete nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah. And finally, we have Canada.
Okay.
Trump suggested we should make it the 51st state. I don't know if he was serious or not.
What was the reaction in Canada? I'm guessing they weren't exactly thrilled with the idea.
Let's just say that the response from our neighbors to the north was less than enthusiastic,
Yeah, I bet.
to put it mildly.
Okay, so we have Trump saying he wants to control Greenland, take back the Panama Canal, and make Canada part of the U.S.,
Right.
but his team is saying that these are all calculated moves. They say it's part of a bigger strategy to stop Russia and China from getting more powerful and to make America stronger on the world stage.
Okay.
They even point to Canada increasing their border security spending as proof that this strategy is working.
Interesting.
What do you think about this whole grand strategy argument?
Well, it's definitely a bold claim. Whether it actually makes sense is something we need to look at carefully
Right.
to really understand it.
Yeah.
I think it would help to look at history and see if the U.S. has ever done anything like this before.
Okay, so historically speaking, the U.S. has definitely had its moments of, assertive foreign policy. Like in the 19th century, we had this idea called manifest destiny. It was basically the idea that we were destined to expand across the whole continent.
Right?
And it didn't always work out so well for the Native Americans who were already living here.
That's true.
Manifest destiny is an interesting comparison because it wasn't just about taking more land. It was about this belief that America was special and had the right to be in charge.
Yeah.
I wonder if we're seeing some of that same thinking in what Trump is saying today.
It's definitely something to think about.
And then there's Nixon's madman theory, where he basically tried to make people think he was unpredictable and might do crazy things to scare our enemies.
Interesting.
Do you think we're seeing any of that in Trump's actions?
Well, the madman theory worked because the U.S. had a really strong military that could actually back up those threats.
Right.
So it made other countries believe that Nixon might actually do something irrational if he got angry.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I think the question is whether that same kind of fear still works today, especially in Latin America.
That's a good point.
Could Trump's unpredictable behavior actually make things worse if other countries don't take his threats seriously?
Yeah, like a gamble.
Right.
You're betting they'll be too scared to call your bluff.
Exactly.
And the Panama Canal situation makes things even more complicated.
How so?
Well, because historically, the Panama Canal represents a time when the U.S. started moving away from that kind of direct colonial control.
Right.
I mean, we did control the canal for a big part of the 20th century.
Right.
But it was through a treaty with Panama, not because we just owned it outright.
Okay.
And then in 1977, President Carter signed treaties that eventually gave Panama full control of the canal.
That's a key point.
It showed that the U.S. was moving away from just taking over other countries and towards a more cooperative approach.
Yes, more based on partnerships, alliances, and agreements.
So when Trump talks about taking back control of the canal, it seems like he's going backwards.
Hmm.
Like he's trying to go back to a time when the U.S. just did whatever it wanted.
It definitely goes against how U.S. foreign policy has been working for decades.
Yeah, it's a big change.
And a lot of foreign policy experts are worried about it.
Why is that?
They think this approach could undermine all the progress we've made towards a more cooperative and multilateral world order.
Okay, so we've talked about Trump's comments, and we've looked at them through a historical lens.
Right.
But the big question I keep coming back to is there a real strategy here, or is this just Trump being Trump?
I think that's the million-dollar question.
Is he some kind of brilliant strategist playing 4D chess, like
Yeah.
some of his supporters think?
Yeah.
Or is he just reacting to things without thinking about the consequences?
It's a question that a lot of experts are debating, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Right.
But one thing's for sure, whatever his reasons are, what Trump does in Latin America will have a big impact on the region and probably on the U.S. too.
Yeah, and it's not just some theoretical geopolitical game either.
No.
This is real-life stuff that affects people's lives, economies, and political stability.
You're absolutely right. People need to pay attention to how these relationships change and understand what's really going on.
Okay, so let's talk about Trump's focus on Latin America.
Yeah.
He's brought in some pretty experienced people to deal with the region.
Okay.
Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State. Christopher Landau is the Deputy Secretary of State. And Mauricio Claver-Carrón is the Special Envoy to Latin America.
Right.
These are people with strong opinions and a lot of connections in Latin America.
Yes, they are.
What do you think about these appointments? What does it tell us about what Trump wants to do in his second term?
These are significant appointments. You don't put together a team like that unless you're planning to use their expertise.
Yeah,
So the question is, what kind of policies can we expect to see?
that's what I'm wondering. We know Rubio has been a big critic of leftist governments in Latin America.
Right.
He's been pushing for a tougher stance against countries like Cuba and Venezuela.
And when Landau was ambassador to Mexico, he was really focused on security issues like drug trafficking and border security.
And then there's Claver-Carrón, who's known for his hardline views on Cuba and his support for sanctions against the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Looking at their track records, it seems like we might see a more confrontational approach towards some countries in the region.
It's definitely possible Claver-Carrón in particular has been very vocal about the U.S. taking a more active role in trying to change the government in Venezuela.
That's kind of scary when you think about it,
Why do you say that?
because those regime change efforts often have unintended consequences,
Oh, yeah.
and they can destabilize entire regions.
Absolutely. The fallout from those actions can be devastating, both for the countries involved and for the whole region.
It's a delicate situation.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how Trump balances his America First rhetoric with what he actually does in Latin America.
Yeah.
There's this weird back and forth between domestic politics and foreign policy that we need to keep an eye on.
Agreed. That dynamic will be crucial to watch as things unfold.
So we've talked about Trump's pronouncements, the doubts people have about them, and what his focus on Latin America could mean.
Right.
But there's one more thing we need to address, and it's a little unnerving:
What's that?
the possibility of military intervention. We can't ignore the fact that Trump has hinted at using force in the region.
You mean like when he threatened tariffs on Mexico to stop drug trafficking?
Yeah, exactly. And there were even reports that he was talking about launching missile strikes against cartels.
Wow.
And don't forget that several Republican presidential candidates said they were in favor of military action against drug trafficking during the primaries.
Right. So the idea is definitely out there.
Which is pretty alarming when you think about it.
Yeah.
The consequences of the U.S. getting involved militarily in Latin America are huge.
They could be devastating.
Yeah.
It could lead to widespread instability, humanitarian crises, and even more damage to U.S. relations in the region.
So how seriously should we take these threats? Is he just talking tough, or is there a real chance that Trump might actually use military force?
That's the question everyone's asking.
Yeah.
It's really hard to say for sure what Trump's intentions are.
Right.
He has a history of unpredictable behavior, and he's not afraid to break the rules.
That's true.
So it's impossible to say for sure that he won't take military action.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. And it just shows how serious the situation is.
Yeah, right. The stakes are incredibly high.
They are. And that's why these conversations are so important.
Yeah.
We need to analyze what's happening, be aware of the risks, and encourage everyone to think critically about these issues.
I completely agree. We can't just sit back and assume everything will work out.
No.
We need to stay informed, stay involved, and be ready for whatever happens.
I agree. All said.
Okay, I think we should spend a little more time talking about the historical context,
Okay.
because understanding the past can often help us understand what's happening now.
I agree.
And it might help us figure out where Trump's foreign policy is headed.
Makes sense.
History often repeats itself.
It does.
And by looking at past patterns, we might be able to get some clues about what to expect in the future.
Okay. I like that. You mentioned history repeating itself, and I think that's where these historical parallels can really help us.
Okay, tell me more.
Let's go back to Manifest Destiny for a minute.
Okay.
It wasn't just about expanding west. It was about this belief that America was exceptional and destined to rule.
Right.
So does any of that sound familiar when you hear Trump talking today?
Yeah, it does a little.
And if so, what could happen if we try to bring back that kind of thinking in the 21st century?
It makes you wonder how those expansionist desires, the ones driven by a sense of exceptionalism,
Yeah,
how would they play out in a world where the U.S. isn't the only superpower anymore?
that's a really important point. The world has changed a lot since the days of Manifest Destiny. We're all connected now, and what happens in one part of the world affects everyone else.
And that brings us back to Nixon's madman theory.
Right.
We talked about how it depended on having a strong military to back up the threats. But does that still work today, especially in Latin America?
Good question.
Could Trump's unpredictability actually backfire if other countries don't take his threat seriously?
It's definitely a risk. If the threat isn't believable, then the madman theory doesn't work.
Right.
It could even make things worse by escalating tensions unnecessarily.
Yeah. It's a dangerous game to play.
It is.
And the Panama Canal just adds another layer of complication.
In what way?
Well, we said before that it represented a shift away from direct colonial control,
Uh-huh.
a move towards a more cooperative approach
Mm-hmm.
based on treaties and agreements.
Right.
But when Trump talks about taking back control, he's ignoring those historical lessons.
Yeah, it seems like he's trying to turn back the clock.
And what I find really concerning is that he doesn't seem to care about the economic consequences of what he's saying.
That's a problem.
The articles you said mentioned worries about how his policies could hurt the economy.
I see.
So what specific industries or sectors in Latin America could be hit the hardest by these aggressive trade tactics?
Right.
Or by attempts to control resources?
That's something we need to watch closely.
Yeah.
Latin America is a major trading partner for the U.S.,
Right?
and messing with those economic relationships could have serious consequences for both sides.
Exactly. And it's not just about the economy either.
What else are you thinking about?
Think about the impact on political stability and
Wow.
security.
Okay.
If Trump's policies lead to economic hardship or political instability in Latin America,
Yeah.
it could create opportunities for other countries like China or Russia to step in and take advantage.
That's a scary thought.
It is. We've talked a lot about the potential downsides.
Right.
But is there another side to this?
What do you mean?
Could there be any benefits to Trump's approach, even if it is unconventional?
Some people argue that by shaking things up and challenging the status quo,
Yeah.
Trump could force other countries to negotiate and get better deals for the United States.
I see your point. It's like a high-stakes poker game where you bluff and make big moves to try and win.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the bluff could get called,
Mm-hmm.
and the consequences could be really bad.
That's the risk you take. And that's why it's so important to look at all the angles and think about what could happen.
And speaking of things that could happen, we need to talk about the possibility of military intervention.
Okay.
We talked before about Trump's threats about drug trafficking and the reports that he was considering military options.
Right.
And we have to acknowledge that drug trafficking is a serious problem with real consequences for both the U.S. and Latin America.
Absolutely.
But you also said that some people think military intervention is necessary to solve this problem.
Yeah.
So how do we balance those two things?
What do you mean?
The need to do something about drug trafficking
Right.
versus the risks and consequences of military action.
It's a tough call. There are no easy answers.
We have to carefully weigh the potential costs and benefits of every option,
Yeah.
including the long-term impact on regional stability and U.S. relations with Latin American countries.
I agree. It's a balancing act.
And I think it's important to remember that military intervention often has unintended consequences.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as drug trafficking.
Yeah, it's rarely a quick fix, and it can create even bigger problems.
You're right. It can create power vacuums, destabilize governments, and lead to humanitarian crises.
It's not something to be taken lightly.
No, it's not. The human cost of military intervention is something we can't forget.
We have to think about all the possible outcomes before we even consider doing something like that.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at the historical context, the potential risks, and all the different factors at play.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
That's a great question.
What are the most important things they should be watching as this situation unfolds?
I think the most important thing for people to understand is that what Trump is doing with his foreign policy, especially in Latin America,
Yeah.
it's a big change from how the U.S. has been doing things lately.
It feels like a shift away from working with other countries.
Yeah.
And towards a more go-it-alone, aggressive approach.
Exactly. And while there might be some good things about this approach, the risks are huge.
Yeah.
There's a real chance of economic problems, political instability, and even military conflict.
And this isn't just some abstract geopolitical stuff.
No.
This has real consequences for people's lives, their jobs, and their safety.
Absolutely.
Everyone needs to stay informed and engaged.
Yes, they do. Pay attention to how these relationships develop. Try to understand what's going on and think critically about the information you see and hear.
This is a story that's still being written,
Yeah,
and we all need to be paying attention.
well said.
I think it's also important to point out that these issues are complicated.
They are.
There aren't any easy answers.
No.
We need to look at things from different perspectives, consider the risks and benefits, and have serious discussions about the best way forward.
I agree.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and look at one last piece of this puzzle. This is something that could completely change the geopolitical landscape.
What are you thinking about?
China's growing influence in Latin America.
Hmm.
If Trump is really serious about stopping China, how will that play out in the region?
Yeah,
What are the potential flashpoints we should be watching for?
that's a great question. And it takes us into a whole new dimension of this complicated situation.
China's influence in Latin America has been growing for years. It seems like it's been on the radar of U.S. policymakers for a while now.
Yeah, it's definitely been a growing concern.
So China has been strategically investing in infrastructure projects in Latin America.
Right.
They've been securing access to natural resources and building strong diplomatic ties throughout the region.
They have.
It feels like they're playing the long game. you know,
Yeah.
Building those relationships and influence slowly over time while we're stuck reacting to things and making quick decisions.
There's a definite difference in approach. China tends to be more patient and subtle.
Yeah.
They focus on economic cooperation and cultural exchange. While the U.S. has traditionally been more assertive, sometimes using economic or military pressure to get what it wants.
Okay, so if Trump is really serious about countering China's influence in Latin America, what could he actually do?
Well, one thing he could try is to increase economic engagement with the region.
Okay, how would he do that?
He could offer alternative trade deals and investment opportunities to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative.
But would he actually do that? I mean, wouldn't that require a lot of consistency and commitment?
Yeah.
And that's not something we've seen a lot of from the Trump administration.
You're right. It would require a pretty big change in approach
Yeah.
and a willingness to plan for the long term.
Okay, what else could he do?
He could try to strengthen military alliances and partnerships in the region.
Right.
Basically trying to show that the U.S. has more military power and influence than China.
But wouldn't that make China and other countries in the region nervous?
It could. It might be seen as a provocation,
Yeah.
which could lead to even more tension and maybe even an arms race.
It seems like it's a really tricky situation.
It is.
If we're too aggressive, it could backfire and push countries closer to China.
Right.
But if we're too passive, then China could just keep expanding its influence without any resistance.
Exactly. It's a complicated geopolitical game, and every move has consequences.
Okay, so where are the potential flashpoints?
What do you mean?
The specific areas where this competition between the U.S. and China could really heat up.
Well,
What should we be watching for?
one place to keep an eye on is the Panama Canal. China has already invested a lot of money in Panama,
Right.
and there are worries that they might try to take more control of the canal.
That would be a big deal.
Yeah, it would be a major strategic loss for the U.S.
Especially considering how important the canal has been to the U.S. historically.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Another potential flashpoint is Venezuela.
Okay.
China has been a strong supporter of the Maduro regime.
They
They've been
sound-
giving them economic and diplomatic help.
And we've been trying to get rid of Maduro.
Right, so it's a clear point of conflict between the U.S. and China.
And with the U.S. already talking about wanting more control in Latin America, this could easily lead to a fight.
It could.
What about Mexico? They're right next door, and we do a lot of business with them.
Mexico's another important player in this whole thing.
Yeah.
China has been making moves there too, investing in infrastructure and trade.
Hmm.
The way Trump treats Mexico, especially with immigration and trade, could actually push them closer to China.
So basically, there are potential problems everywhere you look.
Pretty much.
And with Trump being so unpredictable and China playing the long game, it's really hard to say what's going to happen.
It is. It's a situation that needs to be watched very carefully.
So we've gone over a lot today.
We have.
Trump's statements, the historical context, and the growing influence of China.
Right.
It's a lot to think about, and it paints a pretty messy picture of the geopolitical world we live in.
It definitely is a lot to take in. But that's why we do these deep dives. We want to break down these complicated issues, look at the evidence, and give you the tools to understand what's going on.
You said it. So here's the big question for everyone listening.
Okay.
Do you think Trump has a real plan for dealing with Latin America and China? Or is this just a bunch of impulsive actions with no long-term strategy?
That's the question.
Think about the historical stuff we talked about.
Right.
Think about what could happen because of Trump's policies.
Yeah.
And think about what it means for China's influence to keep growing. It's up to each of you to look at the evidence, consider the different viewpoints, and decide for yourself what you think.
And remember, this is a situation that's constantly changing. Stay informed, keep asking questions, and don't be afraid to challenge the things you think you know.
Very well said. And as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.